You're a Soviet pilot, 22 years old, gliding silently through enemy airspace at 3,000 feet. Your engine is off. The only sound is the wind rushing past your wooden aircraft, a sound German soldiers will later describe as witches on broomsticks. Below you, Nazi positions sprawl across occupied territory. You release your payload, restart your engine, and bank hard for home. But tonight, your luck runs out. Anti-aircraft fire tears through your wing. You're going down. And as you prepare to crash behind enemy lines, one thought crystallizes with absolute clarity. Capture is not an option. Because you know exactly what the Nazis do to women like you. This wasn't paranoia. This was documented reality. From 1941 onward, Nazi field commanders issued explicit orders about captured female soldiers. Orders that didn't come from the SS or Gestapo High Command, but from regular Wehrmacht officers on the battlefield. Orders that sealed the fate of thousands of women who dared to wear a uniform and carry a rifle. What I'm about to show you isn't speculation. It's documented in Nazi military records, survivor testimonies, and the scattered remains found in concentration camps decades after the war ended. The story of female soldiers in World War II isn't just about bravery. It's about systematic brutality inflicted by an enemy that couldn't even comprehend women as combatants. Before we go deeper into this darkness, make sure you're subscribed. These are the stories they don't teach in schools, and every subscription helps us bring more buried history to light. Now, let's go back to June 1941, when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union and encountered something they never expected. The German Wehrmacht considered itself the most professional military force in Europe. They'd conquered Poland in weeks, France in months, and swept through Norway with mechanical efficiency. Their officers prided themselves on discipline, strategy, and adherence to military tradition. So when Operation Barbarossa launched on June 22, 1941, they expected another textbook campaign. Instead, they found women in uniform, not nurses in field hospitals, not clerks behind desks, women manning anti-aircraft guns, women in sniper positions, women flying combat missions, women fighting alongside men in the trenches. The shock was visceral. German soldiers wrote letters home describing their disbelief and disgust. How could a civilized nation allow women to fight? The very concept violated everything the Nazi ideology preached about gender roles and racial hierarchy. This wasn't just unexpected. It was offensive to their entire worldview. The Soviet Union had mobilized female soldiers on a scale unprecedented in modern warfare. By war's end, over 800,000 women would serve in the Soviet military. Not all in combat roles, but enough that German soldiers encountered armed women regularly on the Eastern Front. 200,000 of these women would be decorated for military service. 89 would receive the Hero of the Soviet Union, the highest military honor possible. Among them were the Night Witches. The 588th Night Bomber Regiment was assembled in late 1941 after Marina Raskova personally convinced Joseph Stalin to authorize female combat units. These weren't token positions. These were real combat squadrons flying real missions into enemy territory. Most of the volunteers were in their late teens and early 20s. They flew obsolete Polikarpov U-2 biplanes, wooden aircraft originally designed for crop dusting and training. But what they lacked in equipment, they made up for in tactics and sheer nerve. Their signature attack method became legendary. Approaching their targets, they would cut their engines and glide silently toward German positions using only the wind. The only sound was the fabric of their wings rustling in the night air. German soldiers on the ground described it as the sound of broomsticks sweeping through the sky. That's how they earned their nickname, Nachtwechseln, Night Witches. Over the course of the war, these women flew 30,000 combat hours and dropped over 3,000 tons of bombs on German positions. They flew multiple missions per night, sometimes 8 or 9 sorties in darkness. They operated without parachutes because the weight would reduce their bomb capacity. They navigated without radar using only maps and compasses. And when they were shot down, they faced something far worse than death. June 29, 1941. 7 days into Operation Barbarossa, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge issued an order that would define the fate of captured Soviet women soldiers for the rest of the war. The order was simple and absolute. Any captured female soldiers were to be shot on sight. Not imprisoned. Not interrogated. Shot dead. This wasn't an SS directive. This wasn't Gestapo policy. This came from regular Wehrmacht field commanders. Von Kluge was followed by Field Marshal Walter von Reichenau and 75th Division General Ernst Hammer. Within 4 months, the practice was normalized across the Eastern Front. Think about what this means. The German military, which prided itself on professionalism and adherence to military codes, issued execution orders for female prisoners of war as standard operating procedure. The Geneva Convention, which theoretically protected POWs, meant absolutely nothing. The rationale was never officially stated, but the subtext was clear in every letter, every diary entry, every recorded conversation. Women in uniform violated the natural order. They were aberrations. Dealing with them as legitimate combatants would legitimize the Soviet Union's perversion of gender roles. Better to eliminate them and erase the evidence that such women existed. But elimination wasn't always immediate. And in the delay between capture and execution, unspeakable things happened. The Eastern Front became a graveyard for prisoners of war on both sides, but Soviet POWs faced particularly horrific conditions. The Nazis captured approximately 6 million Soviet prisoners during the war. Half of them died in captivity. They weren't killed in combat. They were left to starve. They were worked to death. They were executed for sport. They died of exposure, disease, and systematic neglect that violated every principle of the Geneva Convention. For women POWs, the situation was exponentially worse. Survivor testimonies describe what happened in the hours and days between capture and execution. German soldiers, already conditioned by Nazi ideology to view Slavic peoples as subhuman, treated captured Soviet women as something beneath even that. They were women who had violated the sacred boundary of femininity by taking up arms. They deserved whatever happened to them. The abuse was systematic and widespread. Not isolated incidents committed by rogue units, but routine behavior enabled and encouraged by command structure that had already ordered these women's deaths. Why show restraint toward someone you've been ordered to execute? Many Soviet women soldiers understood this reality long before they were captured. Multiple accounts describe women keeping final bullets for themselves. Not to use against the enemy, but to use on themselves if capture became inevitable. They knew execution was preferable to what came before. The night witches developed their own protocols. If a crew was shot down and survival seemed possible, the standing order was clear. Do not allow yourself to be taken alive. Some carried cyanide capsules. Others made pacts with their crew members to ensure a quick death rather than fall into German hands. This wasn't cowardice. This was rational calculation based on documented reality. But some women were captured, and some survived long enough to tell their stories. Christina Skarbek wasn't Soviet, but she faced the same fate structure operating across Nazi-occupied Europe. The Polish agent worked for Britain's Special Operations Executive as a courier for the Polish resistance. She was the first female agent recruited by the SOE and would become its longest-serving operative. Her missions took her deep into Nazi-occupied territory, moving between countries, carrying intelligence, coordinating resistance networks. It was work that required not just courage but extraordinary resourcefulness. One mistake meant capture, and capture meant death. In January 1941, Skarbek and a fellow agent were arrested by Hungarian police in Budapest. They were handed over to the Gestapo for interrogation. The playbook was well established by this point. Interrogation, torture, execution. The only variable was how long each phase lasted. But Skarbek understood something crucial about the Nazi bureaucracy. It ran on documentation, medical assessments, procedures. If you could introduce uncertainty into the system, you could exploit it. During her Gestapo interrogation, she began displaying symptoms of pulmonary tuberculosis, coughing fits, difficulty breathing, and blood. She bit her tongue hard enough to produce bleeding, then coughed the blood into her handkerchief during medical examination. The doctor, following standard medical procedure, diagnosed tuberculosis. Tuberculosis meant quarantine. Quarantine meant separation from other prisoners. Separation meant delay. And delay meant opportunity. Skarbek was released on medical grounds. The Gestapo, terrified of infectious disease spreading through their facilities, chose to let one sick woman go rather than risk contaminating their entire operation. She would survive the war and become known as one of Britain's greatest intelligence assets. But her survival came down to a single moment of desperate improvisation. One bitten tongue, one fooled doctor, one bureaucratic loophole in a system designed to kill her. Others weren't so fortunate. Noor Inayat Khan was a British agent who worked as a radio operator for the SOE in France. She operated under the codename Madeline, coordinating resistance communications in one of the most dangerous roles in occupied Europe. Radio operators had the shortest life expectancy of any SOE agent. The Nazis had sophisticated detection equipment that could triangulate radio signals. Standard protocol was to broadcast for no more than 20 minutes from any location before moving. Khan sometimes had to broadcast for hours to get critical intelligence through to London. She was hired specifically because of what her recruiters called her lack of ruse, an almost pathological inability to deceive in normal conversation. It made her terrible at the normal spy craft of maintaining cover stories under casual questioning. But it also made her transmissions sound natural and uncontrived, harder for German analysts to identify as intelligence traffic. Khan's philosophy was rooted in nonviolence, the pacifist principles she'd been raised with. But that nonviolence led her to accept some of the most violent positions in the war. She understood that someone had to maintain communications. If not her, then someone else would die doing it. In 1943, she was betrayed. The Gestapo arrested her in Paris. From the moment of capture, she was classified as a dangerous prisoner. She attempted escape multiple times. She refused to cooperate with interrogation. She maintained operational security even under torture, never revealing her network or her contacts. The Gestapo transferred her between facilities, always under maximum security protocols. Eventually, she and 3 other female prisoners were sent to Dachau concentration camp. They arrived in 1944. On September 13th, they were taken to the crematorium. Each woman was forced to kneel. Each was shot once in the back of the head. Their bodies were burned immediately to eliminate evidence. Noor Inayat Khan was 30 years old. She was posthumously awarded the George Cross, Britain's highest civilian decoration for gallantry. A memorial bust stands in London, but no memorial can erase the reality of how she died, or why. She was executed not for military action but for the simple act of resistance, for refusing to submit, for maintaining her humanity in a system designed to crush it. Reba Whittle's story reveals a different dimension of the same horror. The Nazi inability to categorize women in military roles led to bizarre outcomes that could either save lives or destroy them. Whittle joined the U.S. Army as a nurse in June 1941 and trained as a flight nurse, a novel and incredibly dangerous role. Flight nurses flew into combat zones to evacuate wounded soldiers, often coming under fire while loading patients. They worked alone, performing medical procedures normally reserved for doctors, all while their aircraft maneuvered to avoid enemy fighters. In September 1943, Lieutenant Whittle's C-47 transport aircraft flew 40 miles off course over Germany. The plane wasn't marked as a medical flight because it was only carrying supplies, not patients. Above Aachen, German anti-aircraft fire shredded the aircraft. Whittle was wounded. One pilot was wounded. Another crew member was killed. The plane crashed in German-controlled territory. The survivors, including Whittle, were immediately captured by Wehrmacht soldiers. Here's where the paradigm broke down. The Nazis had protocols for captured male soldiers. They had protocols for captured civilians. They even had protocols for captured partisan fighters. But an American female military officer, the system had no category for her. Whittle and her crew were taken to a hospital where they received treatment for their wounds. Then the bureaucratic confusion began. Was she a prisoner of war? Was she medical personnel protected under the Geneva Convention? Was she even legitimate military? The Germans transferred her to a hospital within Stalag 9th C, a prisoner of war camp. But they didn't imprison her. They put her to work as a nurse. Think about the absurdity. The same military that executed Soviet women soldiers on sight couldn't figure out what to do with an American nurse in uniform. The ideological framework that viewed women in combat as aberrations somehow couldn't extend that logic to a flight nurse. So they defaulted to the only category their worldview allowed. She must be there to provide care. This categorization saved her life. The International Red Cross discovered her presence during a camp inspection and notified the U.S. State Department. In January 1945, Whittle was released in a prisoner exchange. She returned to the U.S. Army and was awarded the Purple Heart. Reba Whittle was the only American woman captured by the Germans in the European theater. Her survival was not due to military protocol or humanitarian principle. It was due to sheer ideological confusion. The Nazis literally could not process her existence within their worldview, and that cognitive dissonance created the bureaucratic space for her survival. But for every Reba Whittle, there were thousands of Soviet women who faced the system when it functioned exactly as designed. The liberation of concentration camps in 1945 revealed evidence that had been hidden for years. Among the mountains of documentation, the mass graves, the survivor testimonies, there were scattered references to female Soviet soldiers. Not many, because most had been executed immediately upon capture, as ordered. But some had been sent to camps. Some had been used for forced labor. Some had been subjected to medical experiments. And some remains were finally identified decades later through forensic analysis. The numbers are difficult to establish with certainty because the Nazis destroyed records as they retreated. But estimates suggest thousands of Soviet women soldiers were captured and executed during the war. Thousands more died in camps. The exact figures will never be known because many were never recorded in the first place. They were killed and buried in unmarked graves across the Eastern Front. Their names lost, their service unrecorded. They became ghosts of a war that tried to pretend they never existed. The night witches who survived the war returned to a Soviet Union that celebrated their service but never fully acknowledged what they'd endured. The women who'd been captured and somehow survived faced suspicion and interrogation. Stalin's regime viewed any Soviet soldier who'd been captured as potentially compromised, possibly a traitor. So these women, who'd survived Nazi execution orders and concentration camps, came home to a government that questioned their loyalty. It would take decades for their stories to be fully told, for historians to piece together what actually happened to female soldiers on the Eastern Front, for the evidence to overcome the silence and erasure that had been imposed by both Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. What the Nazis did to captured female soldiers wasn't an aberration or the action of isolated units. It was systematic policy enabled by military leadership and executed by regular soldiers who'd been conditioned to see women in uniform as violations of natural order. The execution orders came from field marshals. The brutality was carried out by ordinary Wehrmacht troops. The camps that imprisoned and killed these women were operated by regular SS personnel following standard procedures. This wasn't the Holocaust with its industrial machinery of genocide. This was something that ran parallel to it. The systematic elimination of women who dared to fight. Women who proved that courage and military capability had nothing to do with gender. Women who threatened the entire Nazi ideology simply by existing. And when they were captured, they were erased. Shot in forests. Worked to death in camps. Executed in crematoriums. Their bodies burned. Their names forgotten. Their service denied. But the documentation survived. The testimonies survived. The memorials built decades later survived. And now their stories survive. Christina Skarbek, who bit her tongue and fooled the Gestapo. Noor Inayat Khan, who refused to break even under torture. Reba Whittle, who survived because the enemy couldn't categorize her. The night witches, who flew into darkness knowing capture meant death. The unnamed thousands who died in forests and camps across the Eastern Front. These women fought the same war as their male counterparts. They faced the same enemy, but they faced additional horrors specifically because they were women in a world that couldn't accept women as warriors. The Nazis did unspeakable things to capture female soldiers not despite their military service, but because of it. Every woman in uniform was a challenge to their ideology. Every female prisoner was evidence that their worldview was a lie. So they tried to eliminate that evidence. They failed. The evidence survived. The stories survived. The truth survived. And now you know what they tried so hard to hide. If this story matters to you, subscribe to make sure we can keep telling the ones they tried to erase. Hit that like button if you believe these voices deserve to be heard. And leave a comment telling me which untold story of World War II you want to hear next. Because history's darkest chapters aren't just about what happened. They're about making sure we never forget.